What is up, Internet peoples? This is Wednesday, October 5th. This is Science Bro Special Soil Balancing Edition. We just wrapped up another session of soil balancing, and I was starting to prepare some content for the next session. And there were some things that I wanted to share with the YouTube world. And I think most people have no clue what they're up against with managing a soil, let alone all of the obstacles, let alone some of the obstacles, I guess you could say. In the soil balancing class, we go through all of these obstacles and provide solutions to all of the obstacles, but that takes about 8 weeks to go over it. So the next class is going to be started Thursday, November 3rd. We're going to be holding that class session at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, date time, Mountain Time, whatever it may be. But that seems to be a time period when the majority of people can actually make it. So I hope you're all available for that. We will be launching pretty soon. For those that are interested in that, you can go to our website, go to the Learn tab, and you can click on the master classes and you can see all the information there. So I'll link that in the description and bio below. So what I wanted to talk about today is what you're really up against as a farmer that's growing in soil. And so when you're a hydroponic farmer in rock wool substrate, for example, that substrate is fairly inert. It's not contributing much of anything in the way of minerals or any composition. And so there's not additional variation to the cultivation space being contributed through the media or the substrate. There's all kinds of other things to deal with, but with what the roots are currently living in is not providing variation. So there's tremendous advantages moving into living soil, but there are some other things to manage. So like in hydroponics, you need to manage fluctuating pH, you need to manage fluctuating water temperature. In living soil, you need to manage the massive variation that is being provided to you by soil manufacturers of every type. And in our consulting work, in our quest to provide quality products to our clients, we have crossed a lot of paths with various soil blenders and manufacturers. As a consultant, I've provided professional analytical advice to 5 different soil blenders in the state of California. Some of those are quite small. One of those currently has the largest soil blending line in the entire United States. So I have a pretty firm grasp on what is happening with the soil blending process that most people are completely unaware of, and especially the soil blenders. Most of them don't look into it. Most of the soil blenders that I've worked with, they definitely don't sample every batch. They definitely don't sample every week. They definitely don't sample every month. Most of the soil manufacturers that I've worked with for and had soil made at, they might batch test periodically. And that doesn't really tell you a whole lot about your process as a manufacturer of soil. And even to more complicate that, if you take a given, say 100-yard batch of soil and you send in one sample, it doesn't give you any indication of the variation of that batch. And so the work that Sarah and I have done with soil blenders in particular has been to first and foremost identify that variation, locate where it's coming from, and then come up with strategies to remove that variation. So as a farmer, you really need to understand that this is taking place and develop a strategy for how to approach it. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into some of the content that we have here today. So I'm going to jump over to my little teleprompter, or not teleprompter, what was that thing the teachers had, the overhead projector. There we go. So I'm going to jump to the overhead projector, and the most common form of soil blending is literally just putting a pile on the ground, and they come over with a tractor and they scoop it up into a mix. A lot of times they'll take a tote bag and they'll suspend it from a forklift. They'll cut a hole in it, and all the minerals will go into the top of the pile. What ends up happening is you end up with soil minerals that are scattered throughout the top like maybe snow onto a mountaintop. And when the tractor comes in from this side and starts scooping at it, it comes from this side and scoops up a little bit, and comes from this side and scoops up a little bit. And what you end up with is these minerals are roughly distributed, on this side and this side. So the minerals from the tote get dumped on the top and try to be mixed with the tractor on a pad. What you end up with is this section where there's compost that the minerals don't get mixed into. And this variation, as they start to then scoop off a hunk and put it into totes and scoop off another hunk, put it into totes and scoop off another hunk and put it into totes and come around to this side and do the same thing, the variation between these totes of soil and these totes of soil can be 100%. Even when I do my best, most accurate, most disciplined, somewhat OCD strategy to try and make this process more consistent, there's still a good 20 to 30% variation in that soil. And so some of the soil blenders will put a little bit more effort into it. They'll drop the minerals onto the top section, and they'll have some of like those little freeway blocks, and they build these little bunkers, I guess you could say. And they build like a little triangle corner. And then they take this pile and they put it into the bunker and come at it with the forklift and turn it and turn it and turn it. And they're able to push it up into the corner, scoop it all, and kind of roll it on itself. The problem with that is they start to compress it wildly, and that starts to become some other problems. So the more that you try to use a tractor to homogenize the soil, you start to reduce it in volume. And most of the soil blenders are not interested in reducing their soil volume to not have as much to sell. So most of them do just a light bit of blending. This is by far the most common strategy to blend soil because it's the most cost effective. Most soil blenders, if you're going to get into soil blending, you at minimum need a tractor. So they start out with a tractor and they do what we call pad mixing. So in the pad mixing, there's a certain level of variation that can be just inherent to the process, and it just is what it is. So that can be good, it can be bad. A lot of the soil that you buy is actually made with a tractor on a pad mix because that's most accessible, especially like the local mountain regions and whatnot. So this is by far the most common strategy, and the soil can look nice because it got the perlite or whatever it is blended all up in there. And then once they get it mixed, then they come over and they'll have like a tote filler. And so this thing sometimes will have little straps that holds on to the tote, which is kind of nice. And it holds it up, and they come over here with their tractor and they dump it into the totes, and they fill up 1 tote, 2 tote, 3 totes, 4 totes. So that's pretty common practice. Sometimes they'll have a little conveyor belt, and they'll drop it on there, and it'll get extra fancy, and it'll kind of go down, and it goes in kind of cool. So sometimes the conveyor belts are kind of fun. So most of the facilities will have like a tote filler that allows you to then come and you can pick it up with the forklift right here, and it makes it nice and easy. So there's that. A lot of soil blenders then work their way up to a soil blending machine. So you have like Ellis manufacturing, you have Baldwin Lawson manufacturing, you have Pack manufacturing. There's a lot of these companies that make some sort of 1, 2, 3, or 4 yard totes. A lot of times they'll have a what they call a ribbon blender in it. So Baldwin Lawson has ribbon blenders. Ellis has more of like a track. So it has these tracks on each side. And then what the tracks will do is it'll have these like little ladder type deals. And as this little machine rotates in this direction, it kind of turns everything. And it's nice once you get to a little level of automation, but there's some downside to these pieces of equipment as well, because with the Ellis machine specifically, when it's rotating on a trajectory like this, there's no side to side movement. And so the nice thing about the Baldwin Lawsons and the ribbon blender ones is they kind of make up for this side-to-side action that needs to happen. Some of the soil blenders we've worked with, it has more of like an Ellis type machine. They'll actually add a little auger thing that will do side-to-side movement, which is kind of cool, that will make it a little bit better. And again, sometimes they'll have a conveyor belt so employees can, you know, drop the little peat moss cubes on there, and they'll sprinkle a little bit of minerals on there, and it goes in and it auto loads, which is kind of cool. A lot of times though, people will just, they don't have the conveyor belt, and you just have dudes on a ladder just, you know, pouring shit in. And then a lot of times there's some sort of ejector chute, and it goes into this way, and that's kind of fun. It looks kind of like a bong or something. The nice thing about these type of machines is it does make a pretty good mix, but you're limited by, typically, the biggest these style come is like a 4 cubic yard mixer, but when you're doing living soil, that stuff is heavy as shit. And so you might not be able to get but 2, 3, 3.5 yards max into that style of hopper. And so a lot of times the manufacturers, will abandon these types of equipment because it limits their ability to scale. So they work really nice for the small size. I don't want to say a lot of the farms, a good percentage of the larger cannabis farms will ultimately pick up one of these machines, and that will help them to mix their potting mixes on site, which is a tremendous advantage. Downside is, you know, these type of machines, I mean, they're a 6 to 8 week lead time. I haven't checked the price, but this might be a $40,000 mixer right now at this stage. And yeah, what up, dude? Tough acting, Tinactin. Boom. Wait till I start getting this highlighter up in there, right? You know what I'm saying? Just be like, tote, soil, woo woo. John Madden, I love this shit. It's really hard to communicate everything with just your hands. So yeah, dude, I love John Madden shit. Hopefully this is more entertaining than just my face on the TV screen. But these machines work really nice. You know, somebody like Baldwin Lawson, which is a solid dude that is heavily involved in the cannabis space, has always been a good dude. Baldwin Lawson will actually do like a double machine. And so they'll do two 2-yard mixers kind of stacked on top of each other. And then, you know, the little deal dumps in. So they'll have 2-yard mixers, and it keeps it from damaging the soil, which is kind of nice. But again, with living soil, that's 2 yards of cocoa core soil and nursery potting mix, not heavy ass 30% compost living soil. So again, those have their limitations, they have their advantages. Those type of smaller 2, 3, 4 yard machines are really good for large greenhouses, large indoor facilities, things like that. But they do tend to significantly limit the soil manufacturing facilities. Then there's this other really kooky one that's actually kind of my favorite. Yeah, exactly, David King. It's not really a cement truck. It's actually for feeding cattle. So it looks like a trash truck or a school bus. This is the best image I could find on Keynote when I was drawing this up. But what'll happen is it'll have these augers in the inside the hopper. So this is looking down into the truck, and so they have a low one down like this, and they'll have a third one up here, and they'll have these little different augers, and you dump all the goods into it, and these little guys go do 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 do. And the way that it causes it to mix is pretty cool, because it'll actually cause it to kind of go up and down like this. And then because it's actually designed for feeding cattle, there'll be like a little chute, a little conveyor belt that dumps it out onto the ground. And some guys I've seen, they'll dump it onto the ground. They'll actually come with a tractor and give it one more turn. And this is actually my favorite, but this is like sometimes $150,000 truck. And typically, you know, my soil, it's quite heavy. You might only get 20 cubic yards of soil into this like school bus looking contraption, although it's my favorite. Some of the best soils that we've had made that were the most consistent came out of this type of truck cattle feed homogenizer or something like that. And so they have some tremendous advantages, but again, you start being a soil blender that gets into the hundreds or thousands of yards, and like this boy don't cut it, or well, I think it does cut it, but then it takes labor and it's expensive to run this, and they always want to move up to our next style, which is an assembly line, which is like the soil blender's dream of moving up into the big time. And so, you'll have these different hoppers, and they want to fill them up, with gypsum or whatever. They might put, some sort of nitrogen in this one, and they might put some sort of like rock dust or something in there. And the attractiveness of this style of assembly line blender is total control, right? We're always after total control. Like, we want to dose everything, and we want to have flexibility, and we want to be strategic, and we want to like batch mix, and we want to like, get these machines to eliminate labor. And I would say that this is by far my least favorite style. And so what you end up having is, here's a conveyor belt, and they'll come over here and they'll dump the compost and soil or whatever, and then as it moves across the conveyor belt, it'll a computer box here will from the command center will say, give me 100 pounds of gyp, and it'll like dump it onto the conveyor belt, and they'll be like, give me 20 pounds of nitrogen, and it'll dump it on the little conveyor belt, and then whatever the hell's in here, they'll drop it in here, and it comes across this conveyor belt, comes into some other type of ribbon blender that's similar to the first example I gave, typically 2, 4, 6, sometimes 20-yard hoppers, and all this stuff goes across on a conveyor belt, and it dumps in, and it mixes, and then there's an elevator chute, and so when it's time to dump it, the soil comes out this elevator chute and goes into the soil tote bags. And then what this does is this massively reduces employees because you've automated all this stuff. But this creates the most problems, especially with gypsum. This is your, here we're going to get our John Madden on. So we got an offensive front or defensive front here that comes in and starts doing some X and O's, and the gypsum always screws you. This stuff jams up in there, so it gets kind of clogged up. And what you'll end up having is you'll have like 30 totes of soil go across the assembly line, and it's time to refill the other hoppers, and the employees be like, oh shit, we still got all the gypsum in hopper number 1. And so all these totes that went through when the gypsum wasn't dumping through accurately and appropriately, they all got no gypsum. So the consequence to the farmer, when there's no gypsum put into the mix, the compost is very high in potassium, coco coir is very high in potassium, peat moss is somewhat high in potassium, and without that gypsum and oyster shell, and interestingly enough, the agricultural lime, the oyster shell, the gypsum, they all love to clump. They all love to get stuck in hoppers. And so you as a farmer, what you end up with is a soil that's lacking the timeout. It's missing all of the calcium that soil blender intended to put in there. By my definition, even that full amount is not near enough. So you have a soil that mathematically didn't start out with enough gypsum because the formulas are whack. And then you got this crazy thing with this gypsum clogging up in here, and you don't get any gypsum in there. And then the employees just go, oh crap. And they get up there with a stick and like they poke it and they poke it. And then all this like mustard plug falls out onto the conveyor belt. And then the next 30 totes get 60 to 90 totes worth of gypsum, which is cool because then you start to burn plants with excessive sulfur. And so this is like the natural trajectory of what most soil blenders dream of. And it can be good, I guess, when things go well. But when things don't go well, it's pretty messed up for the farmer. So this is a tremendous problem. A lot of your major soil manufacturers use this type because it's just, you're talking about like thousands of cubic yards of soil. And so I understand the desire to move up in scale and handle the material loads that have been put on you or the material demands that it put on you by your product demand, which is fantastic that you're selling that much soil. But it really starts to create problems for the end user. And that's where I come in, and that's where you come in, I guess. So when we look at these numbers mathematically, what we end up with is we end up with, this is a practical example with 4 batches of soil. This happened to be 4 different greenhouses, we'll say. This could be 4 beds. This could be 4 pots. It can be any number of things. So in this situation, let's examine this as 4 greenhouses that came with an entire truckload of soil. And so starting off right off the bat, for those of you that have been paying attention, the first thing I look at here is the total exchange capacity. The total exchange capacity can indicate, generally speaking, the totality of nutrients in that soil, because the total exchange capacity is taking into consideration the values for calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and these 2 little numbers here called other bases and exchangeable hydrogen. So it's taking a totality of these 2 numbers and what they call the exchangeable cations, which cation just means positively charged. So if we examine just the exchange capacity here on these 4 soils, we have a 10.71, we have an 11, we have a 19, and we have a 13. By my math, by my experience guiding farmers to successful, productive commercial yields that are financially viable, and now yield isn't our only marker, but if you're going to be a commercial enterprise, whether that's 1 light or 1,000 lights or 1,000 acres or 1 square foot, you still need to produce more than it costs you to execute, or else you just become a hobby. And so in order to have the soil component provide enough nutrition to even have a shot at having enough yield or nutrition to drive yield, it's my personal opinion that you need to have, at minimum, somewhere between a 15 and an 18. So of these 4 soils, we have 1. These all came off the same truck, remember? So they're all the same, air quotes, batch of soil. But we have a damn near 100% variation between greenhouse 1 and greenhouse 3 from a total nutrient pool. And when we look at the factors that contribute to that exchange capacity number, we can see that clearly. We've only got 1,500 parts per million here. We got 3,000 parts per million here. It's my personal belief that you need at least 2,000 parts per million of calcium with magnesium and potassium all in balance. So the consequence to the farmer becomes, if the farmer bought this soil all at the same time, I 100% promise to you that farmer will look at all that soil as the same. It came from the same place, it came on the same truck, it has the same label. Oftentimes, it might not even come in the same batch, but because it came from the same place, the farmer views it as exactly the same soil. So the consequence of this complete lack of nutrition in greenhouse 1, 2, and I would even define greenhouse 4, you don't even have half of the nutrition needed here to produce an appropriate cannabis yield in a potting soil. So what ultimately happens is, if all these gardens are started at the same time, farmer comes in on Monday morning and looks at greenhouse 1 and says that they're hungry. Because it is. This is barely half of the minerals needed in a soil to produce a substantial yield. So they'll come in, and greenhouse 1 is likely to look hungry first. The farmers most often that we work with in the consulting space will still, again, we're thinking the soil's the same, we're thinking everything's the same. So they'll see plants in greenhouse 1 start to look hungry, which will drive a desire to produce extra nutrition, or to keep that hunger from progressing, or to keep that hunger from accelerating, because in cannabis, it absolutely can happen. Once that hunger starts to really set in visually, there's not much you can do to really overcome it, depending on when in the life cycle it actually starts to happen. So what the farmer does psychologically is, they see greenhouse 1 looks hungry, they then mineral top dress all greenhouses, they might increase the feeds to all greenhouses. And if you don't know what that hunger is coming from, then you're not going to know really what to do to put in there to really improve this situation. Most farmers are going to add nitrogen. Most farmers aren't going to add more calcium. And so what ends up happening is number one is legitimately hungry. Number two is legitimately hungry. Number three might not be hungry. It might have enough nutrition. You're now overfeeding group three. When you start to overfeed group three, that is the basis for most pest problems. So by the way number one looked, we're going to now manufacture a pest problem in greenhouse three. And I hope that makes sense to you of what I'm trying to assert, because most people don't realize it, but you can overfeed plants to then create powdery mildew or mite damage depending on where that deficiency is and how you respond to it. So if we start to look at some of the other numbers, we can work our way down to the magnesium and potassium. When I look at this Mehlich 3 test, the first thing I look at a lot of times is this thing called base saturation. And so base saturation is what this test is actually built on. So Dr. William Albrecht, when he was formulating this process, actually took clay and he soaked it in water for 2 weeks and let it kind of start to degrade. And then he put it into a centrifuge and he spun the living snot out of it for like weeks until he ended up with a blank substrate. So when he had that empty clay colloids, he started to very precisely add minerals to that clay in precise amounts and quantify them on this, what is now termed as the Mehlich 3 test, to determine how much of each cation is occupying that soil space. And it's super fascinating, the research they did. I got a couple of the books back there, these white ones right in the center. Those are Albrecht books. And he actually shows pictures of the plants with the different ratios of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And why that's important is because that seems to determine everything about soil structure. And so the soil structure is determined by the pushing and the pulling forces of calcium and magnesium. So calcium has a pushing away force, often referred to as flocculation. Magnesium has a pulling in force. So it's these opposing forces that actually keep soil particles open and flocculated and full of oxygen. So when this balance of calcium, magnesium, and potassium also contributes, and sodium also contributes to this basic soil structure and microscopic porosity of that soil based on pushing and pulling forces. So what Dr. Albrecht found out was when this calcium level is below 60%, most plants won't even grow properly. In a typical native soil, the standard textbook would say you want about 68% calcium. The textbook would say about 10 to 14% magnesium, and the textbook would say about 4% potassium. And when Dr. William Albrecht went around to these various soils, he actually did a really interesting study in that he would actually go to where people were big, strong, and healthy, and looked at other physical characteristics of those humans. And then he would take soil samples from the surrounding farming regions. And in the places where people were big, strong, healthy, and not having very many health problems, he found that those farming soils were roughly 68% calcium, 12 to 14% magnesium, and about 4% potassium. And so I think that whether you're in a potting soil or a native soil, this is one of the most important considerations, because this pushing and pulling force will determine the oxygen in the root zone. It'll also determine the availability of these other nutrients. And so in a potting soil, 68, 14, and 4 work quite well. We do find in a potting soil it's safe to go a little bit higher, like 70, 71, 72. When we start to get to 78%, that's when people typically call me for problems. Interestingly enough, some of the worst plant health problems are when that calcium gets to over 80% on the Logan Mehlich 3 test. And I think what happens is the calcium starts to kind of bully other nutrients off of that soil particle or that clay colloid that has these exchange sites, which are kind of like parking spots. And so what this test is measuring is what is the distribution of cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, occupying the soil particle parking space, so to speak. And so with a potting soil, if you do 68, 14, 4, you will have better results than nothing. But in a peat moss based soil, you can go a little bit higher. In a cocoa coir based soil, you definitely rewarded to go 70%, 72%, something like that. But I think even a novice can start to tell with what I started to describe that we got, 3, 4, 5, 6% magnesium. We got less than 1% potassium, which is pretty crazy. You don't see that very often. Typically, people are radically over applying potassium. The most common strategies in living soil, like the Coots Tech and all that, not in business, you end up significantly low in calcium. So you end up, typically when people have been doing the Coots Tech and they're having problems and they call me for soil recs, normally you're at like 55 to 58% calcium, usually 15 to 20% magnesium, and somewhere between 10 and as high as like 30% potassium. So if potassium is supposed to be more like 4, 5, 6, 7%, and you're at 30%, that's a significant issue. In the case of this one, we got 1%. These plants are going to burn up under the intensity of the sun because the potassium is what allows the plant to open and close the stomata. They call it stomata conductance. And that stomata needs to be able to open and close to allow transpiration. So there's a consideration of how the nutrients or cations or elements or however you want to term it are in that soil determines porosity and soil structure and water infiltration. In the biological world, we're looking for appropriate ratios of calcium and magnesium to allow oxygen, to allow the proliferation of organisms in the root zone that require oxygen. So in the case of most living soil techniques, you end up well below 60% calcium, and I think it's worth buying these Albrecht books just to see the pictures. It's crazy how messed up the plants grow once this number starts to get below 60%. And so there's a common conversation in like the Coots Tech no-till world that like at a certain point the soil turns into worm castings and we need to turn it, and we can turn it into more soil. I would assert that that desire to dilute that soil is because the calcium is now dropped radically below 60%, magnesium is well over 20%, potassium is well over 20%, and all flat, plain and simple, all hell breaks loose. And if you continue with the standard no-till, water only, Coots Tech, top dressing, you make it worse. So that's a significant issue across the industry where people are just kind of really misguided as to what the strategy for top dressing is. Unfortunately, most of the top dressing advice from the living soil world isn't that helpful for long-term soil health, actually. That's why people really champion having 10, 20, 30 cycles on a soils, because that's actually quite rare if you follow the popular trends. I would say it's impossible, actually. And so a lot of those farms that have those really high cycle counts, we've worked with them one-on-one to correct these common trend strategies that lead to having to throw your soil away. So let's take a look real quick about what these numbers mean. So generally speaking, we don't have enough nutrient in the soil by any stretch of the imagination. These all need to be increased. More importantly, they're so varied that if you feed all of these greenhouses equally, they're not going to respond equally. So that's an important thing from my viewpoint. In this example, you can see clearly, remember the example I said about the hopper with the gypsum? Look at that. The soil that has twice the nutrition also has more than twice the sulfur. This is one of the samples that the hopper got hung up. So this got all the gypsum from the batch before it, really is what happened there. And interestingly enough, I think the homies that were supposed to put the magnesium and the potassium in the soil didn't show up this day because this is kind of rare to never see. This is very rare. This is one of the rarest ones I've seen, to be honest. Normally potassium is quite high. And then if we scroll down to the bottom, we see our bulk density. So our bulk density is how heavy that soil is. And what's interesting about this one is the one with the highest nutrient is actually the lightest. So this is grams per centimeter cubic centimeter actually. I don't know why I don't have the little 3 there. But you got pretty consistent soil weight. Interestingly enough, the one that has the most nutrient is also the lightest. So that's pretty interesting. So if we jump over to our calculator tool, so this is a calculator tool that everybody in the soil balancing class has access to do these types of calculations. And we punch in the numbers here. So I've just transferred the numbers here from sample 1. So 1540 for calcium and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that we're well away from our target of 68%, 12 to 14%, and 4 to 7%. So if we need to increase, so I guess what I should say is this calcium value, this magnesium value, potassium, sodium, exchangeable hydrogen, and other bases can only add up to 100. So as you, increase magnesium, you can see that calcium goes down and potassium goes down. So we need to bring up magnesium and potassium until at least they get to, at least 10% magnesium and at least 4% potassium to start having some half-ass results. So if we add a couple hundred parts per million, we kind of get that. But now you can see, because these numbers are interrelated, as we increase magnesium and potassium, the percentage of soil particle that's occupied by calcium goes down, because remember, these 4 numbers and these 2 numbers can only equal 100. Now if we change this exchangeable hydrogen, it frees up space for these to go up, which is really confusing for people, which is one of the questions here by Smiley, which we'll get to here in a second. So if we increase magnesium and potassium to get them up into that range, we also need to increase calcium to get it back into range. So we're probably going to have to go to at least 2,000 parts per million and 2,500 parts per million. And do you see how potassium now drops in, right? So magnesium's drop, potassium's drop, so we got to go higher on potassium. And we, that drops magnesium, so we got to go higher on magnesium. And then we got to go higher on potassium. So you can see the dilemma here. This is starting to be, this is the one point where when somebody reads the ideal soil and they get to the point of creating a calculator and they go, this is rubbish. I cannot get these numbers into correct range. And so we start to see here, remember, this exchangeable hydrogen, the other bases, and these 4 numbers can only add to 100. So watch what happens when we turn exchangeable hydrogen to 0. Do you see how now these numbers actually pop up back into ideal range? So we probably don't need to go that high on calcium. We could probably just go 2,000. So, you could do this, but here's the thing. This exchangeable hydrogen is present, right? This is being measured on the soil test. And the exchangeable hydrogen is actually a calculation based on pH. So the pH of this soil sample is also quite low. So as the pH goes lower, this exchangeable hydrogen value increases. And if you go to Logan Labs in the customer tools, they show that formula. It's simply a mathematical calculation. And so what's causing the problem here in our ability to hit ideal targets is this exchangeable hydrogen value. And so anything that goes into your soil that causes the pH to drop dramatically is going to cause that exchangeable hydrogen to go up. And a certain amount of that exchangeable hydrogen is desirable, but it starts to occupy space on the clay colloid, and some of it is good. In potting soils, I tend to keep it fairly low. In a native, natural soil type composition with lower organic matter, you do need some. And that exchangeable hydrogen are just other positively charged hydrogen ions that are available for exchanging. So when nutrients are coming, or minerals are coming from the base parent material, what they call reduce in the mineralization process. So they start out as big molecules and they get chopped down. And to what I understand, which I haven't done a ton of research on exchangeable hydrogen, typically I do a lot of research, but this is one where I just stay in the functional ranges of understanding what the numbers do. I will do some more reading on some of these books and try to get some better answers for exchangeable hydrogen. But to what I understand at this point of my educational development is as the pH lowers, there's more hydrogen available to be exchanged in these reducing of large mineral compounds. And so in the case of a native soil with low organic matter, you can see here the test is saying 10 to 15 is good. And I don't know that I would go all the way to 10 to 15. And the reason why I say that is because it wreaks havoc on our spreadsheet. So there's some strategies that we go over in the soil balancing class. This takes an entire 3-hour session to kind of talk about how the exchangeable hydrogen, but the short, simple answer is the pH is currently at 6, which mathematically gives you 13 exchangeable hydrogen. And as the pH comes up, that number will go down. And so if it goes slightly to a 7 or maybe a 5, you can see that this frees up space for these other ions. And I hope that's not terribly confusing or too out of context. What's important to me is that in order to correct this soil that was brand new, we need to go all the way to 2,000 calcium, 250 magnesium, and 300 potassium. And we're currently at 1541, 82, and 71. So if we come down to our other calculator tool that's part of the tools that everybody gets, if magnesium is currently at 82 and we need to go to 250, that's a difference of 168 ppms and a 200% increase in mineral content, basically. That's not nothing, you know? And so if potassium's currently at 71 and we need to go to 300, that's a difference of 230, which is a 300% increase. So at minimum, that sucks ass to have to increase magnesium, potassium by 300% in order to be into even reasonable range for respectable soil behavior. That's not nothing, you know, that's a big deal. So now let's look at the other numbers. So now we're going to look at sample number 3, which is currently at 3,000 parts per million, 91 magnesium, and 73 potassium. Exchangeable hydrogen is not quite as high on this sample, so it's disrupting, but we need to do the same thing. And so when you got about 3,000 parts per million of calcium, you're going to need around 300 parts per million of magnesium and around 350 parts per million of potassium. So you can see with even just a few bits less of exchangeable hydrogen, we can get into that desirable range. Now, as a potting soil, I would still go higher than that. I mean, I want to try and get at least to maybe 70%, which you can see drops the other ones. So we're going to have to increase those again, and we're going to have to increase this. Which again, the exchangeable hydrogen's getting in the way. We're going to use strategies to slightly elevate that pH to reduce some. So it might drop down to 8, might drop down to 7 on the follow-up test, and you can see that we're in range. And again, this is like 6 hours of discussion of how to like really dice this down, but I'm trying to provide some basic nuggets of understanding to the YouTube community. So now let's take a look at our calculator tool, and this sample currently has 91 parts per million of magnesium, and we need to go to 300. Again, that's a 300% increase. That's a sizable jump. We need to go to 400 for potassium. That's a 463% increase, but now we've created a new problem, right? Because the exchangeable hydrogen in the exchange capacity, so the total nutrient pool, which I believe you need at least 20 in a potting soil to have a good cannabis commercial yield. In native soils, you can get away with, 12, 13, 15, 18, something like that. And it's harder to move those larger soils. But in a potting soil for cannabis, I wouldn't even mess around below 20. The first goal is get above that. So in this case, yeah, Smiley, exactly. So in this case, the alkalizing effects of certain things like wollastonite or micronized lime, oyster shell to a certain degree, the calcium components are going to elevate that pH, which is going to lower this exchangeable hydrogen value. But this exchange capacity of 24, we now have a 24 in group 3, and we were only able to get to like an 18 or a 19 in sample 1. And so that's still going to be a significant variation in response to everything else that we do on this farm. And one of the biggest gripes that came from regulated cannabis was the need for track and trace. And people literally, I mean, in Colorado in the early years, like they couldn't even mulch material because they had to weigh it and bag it and go through, specific trash cans, and it's just craziness. And most of the farmers tremendously complained over this track and trace of this new level of accountability, which was obnoxious. And I agree. A lot of the facilities have to have a new employee just for doing that. It's an added cost. It's an added hassle. Doesn't really seem to make sense to anybody. But I was always raised that if an obstacle is presented, you must turn it into an advantage. And so when I got into professional consulting, meaning my first consulting jobs were advising other consultants. But once I started being brought to the farm as me and not working through other people, the first thing that I requested was to take this track and trace per plant yield essentially and turn it into an overhead map. We call it a heat map because we color code it just like we color code everything else. So if the per plant yield is below what's needed for a commercially appropriate yield, it gets colored red. And we get these really cool maps of where deficiency in yield was, which most of the times the farmers aren't physically able to visually identify. But at the end of the day, those farms would hire us because they were having a hard time meeting the income and profit needed to be sustainable. When we started to investigate it, it was because of this. I mean, plain and simple. When you look at a greenhouse with 4 beds, they might be this varied. And if, let's just say for a minute, this is one greenhouse with 4 different beds, most farmers visually are not, I'd say some are, but a lot of farmers aren't going to be able to see visually that bed 1 and bed 2 are significantly underperforming the weight of bed 3. And so that 30 to 40% yield that most farmers were hiring us to help them find is 100% based in this phenomenon at minimum. At minimum, this variation in soil is creating a variation in output or a variation in pest pressure that ultimately leads to a struggle to be financially viable. So most of our work is identifying that variation and fixing it. And a lot of it has to do with soil chemistry. So, some of my counterparts in the industry or other vocal voices in the cannabis space assert that this Malic 3 is inaccurate because it's too varied, because they take too small of a sample size. I will go to the grave saying that's completely untrue. What the varied data on the Malic 3 is indicating to you is the variation in the soil manufacturing process. And I know that because I've intimately analyzed literally some of the largest manufacturers of soil in the United States. I'm now working with a soil manufacturer in Europe, which is pretty cool. Here pretty soon we'll probably have them on the podcast to talk about what's going on in Europe. So I'm pretty damn fluent in soil manufacturing, and I'm not free of mistakes. There are still things that I need to do above and beyond what other people do to manufacture a soil that's consistent, and I have personal strategies that I do for managing inconsistency. For those of you that are the small scale and hand mix, you create more variation oftentimes than the examples I've showed here today. And so that's why we've put together this soil balancing course. It is my personal goal from this point forward to provide the world with as many extremely qualified calculator tool humans as possible. I'm not saying it's for everybody, but everyone that wants to do it, come on in, man. Let's get it done. Because I've worked intimately with the soil blenders, and most of them are not super interested in improving. And so the end user is the one that eats shit. And the soil blenders just keep turning it out, turning it out, turning it out, and turning it out. And so as a farmer in the current state of the world, it's your obligation to go the extra mile to make up for where other people are not doing the things that they need to do to provide a quality product. So that's what we teach you in the soil balancing class. And so we have a lot of small farmers. I mean, there's several people in the chat right now that are members of the soil balancing class, and they're just growing intense, but they have goals and aspirations to move up and become leaders of regulated facilities. We've got several people that want to be agricultural advisors or already are advising other farms. I come from the Soil Food Web Camp. I adore Dr. Lane Ingham. I think of her as like an aunt or a family member. I will go to the grave defending her and a lot of, not all of, but a lot of her Soil Food Web concepts and techniques. And Sarah and I came out as Soil Food Web advisors. And when we first started professionally consulting, right off the top, we'd improved the best in the business by 30 to 40% in all outcomes just by addressing the biology. But by the end of the first year, it was apparent we could not ignore soil chemistry. So if you're a Soil Food Web grad, please do not enter the market and try to advise farmers in 2022 with only biological advice. Please get yourself some mineral chemistry understanding. You don't have to do it through my course. Obviously, I'm pretty proud of my course. To my knowledge, it's the only of its kind, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback of how comprehensive and how incredibly in-depth it is. And so what you get with the soil balancing class is we have a private forum. In that private forum, we have grow logs, we post our soil data, and most importantly, we learn together. We're in a state of the world where most average suburbanites realize something's messed up with the environment. We need people like you that would be interested in this show to be very serious about actual soil regeneration, like not just wearing hats and not hashtagging and not just saying shit, like actually behaving in a way that leads to actual soil regeneration. And to actually regenerate soil, you can't be destroying it through inappropriate mineral chemistry management practices, which is, I'm telling you, mathematically what everyone's doing. So we offered this class, and in essence, I'm creating direct competitors of myself, of something that I took 2 to 3 years to figure out how to do, because to me, fixing farmlands and keeping farmers in business is more important than me making all the money. And so it is our very clear intent of purpose to produce the most qualified, mathematically accurate people out of these master classes. And in the soil balancing class, there's no different. So what we're offering in the soil balancing class is we meet for 8 sessions. We're going to start in November 3rd on Thursday. Classes will be Thursdays at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can get to it from our website. We meet 8 sessions. Everybody has access to our private forum for a full calendar year where you can ask questions. After the 8 sessions are over, all students in all classes meet once a month. So we've now just started doing our monthly meetings with all soil balancing masterclass members that choose to join. And we just go over everybody's data. If you happen to be a consultant in that class, I help you with answering consulting questions and try to help you be successful and, more importantly, stop destroying our soils. Everybody thinks we're building soils, but we're actually destroying soils. So it's pretty serious. We need to figure this out. And we're about to have some significant crashes in agriculture because of the way that we're managing soil chemistry. And the advantage of those of you in the cannabis space is we get 4 harvests in a calendar year. So the good news is you get 4 times the learning experience, but the bad news is you're destroying your soil 4 times faster than the average farmer. And on top of that, most small-scale cannabis farmers are able to put way more nutrients on there. So that can be a significant problem. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the comments to see if we got any cool stuff coming on. I apologize when I'm by myself. It's a little bit harder to keep track of the comments. So it's good to see the average homies in here. Back when I was talking about soil mixing, David was asking about a cement truck. The problem with cement trucks is they have fixed blades on the outside, and so it tends to just compact it down at the center. There's not enough fluidity in the soil mixing. But in the old, in this guy right here, we do have like too zoomed in. We do have the cattle truck example, and that works. That's my favorite, this cattle truck deal. If I was to start a soil yard today, that's what I would use. I think that works the best. What's up? We got Godai here, who is a Masterclass student who is advising various farms. Pretty cool to see. So I don't know if anybody else has other questions. In the class, we go over why dolomite lime is not appropriate. Most of the textbooks define it as an inappropriate. In the ideal soil book, it goes over why. I believe the magnesium is extra alkalizing and the calcium is most unavailable. And holy crap, you got a test that has 6,000 parts per million? That sounds like a potting soil that was made with really fresh compost and way too much nutrient inputs. So that's not a good thing at all. 6,000 parts per million is going to mean, well, shit, let's calculate. Let's see how hard it is to overcome 6,000 parts per million of potassium. So if we have, whoops, gotta hit the right button. There we go. So if we have 6,000 parts per million of calcium, we're going to zero out our exchangeable hydrogen. The most common other bases is 4.2, which is my favorite weed number. So let's see, let's just match it, 6,000 and 6,000. So we're still barely half the target. So does that mean we got to go to 12,000? What do we got to do here? Whoa, hit the wrong button, my bad. We're doing crazy shit on the fly. So 1,500 maybe? We're still way too high, so 18,000. That's kind of close. 1,700. Sorry, 1,700. Man, that's a mess. 20,000, 25,000. This is crazy. There's no way. So what I'm trying to do, I guess I should explain. I'm used to the students that know what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is increase calcium and magnesium until potassium drops below 7. We've done some remarkable work with eliminating and reducing pest problems with biology and with procedure, but when potassium is much higher than 7, 8%, it gets very difficult to do that. So we got to go quite a ways, 2,500 parts per million. Yeah, there you go. So even still, you got to go, this is a hot mess. So 30,000? I don't even know this is possible. Pass. There you go. Pass. Yeah, that'd be a pile of shit soil right there, boy. I wouldn't, that's crazy. I've never seen anything with 30,000 parts per million. I tend to stop about 4,000 parts per million. A lot of people that are counterparts to me like to go that high, and I don't agree that that's a good idea. So the other bases and whatnot are formulas. Here, I'll pull it up while we're letting some other comments develop. So if you go to the customer tools, they just got a new website, which is pretty cool. Logan Labs here. If you go to customer tools, trying to think now, maybe, yeah, here we go. Exchangeable hydrogen. So exchangeable hydrogen is simply a factor of pH. So you can see exchangeable hydrogen equals 0 if pH is 7. If it's more than 0, then it becomes these other basic formulas. So, you know, it's fairly complicated. Not going to go through it all, but here, not fairly complicated, but you don't need me to read all these numbers. You can see that the pH drives the different formulas. So when your pH is between 6 and a 7, you do this math. When it's between 5 and 6, you do this math. That's why when the pH is 6, it's a significant issue because it starts to disrupt the availability of calcium and magnesium and potassium. So where we see really high exchangeable hydrogen numbers are when like too much fish hydrolysate was used. There's a lot of hydrogen-based low pH correcting aspects of fish hydrolysate in particular. We see really high exchangeable hydrogen numbers and very low pH in Korean natural farming, which I'm clearly not a fan of if you've been following along. That creates a lot of problems with nutrient availability. The other issue we see is with low quality compost that's maybe affordable on the commodity market and can be convinced to you that it's good for your soil, but it's pure garbage in my opinion. So a lot of those like ocean animal I'm trying to educate, but being discreet and not getting sued. I don't mess with any sort of fish, lobster, none of that shit. I don't mess with none of it. Because you end up with extremely low exchangeable hydrogen, which disrupts the availability of calcium, magnesium, potassium, which also makes it difficult to hit those desirable targets. So I don't use any of that compost or advise it or like seeing it. But yeah, what's up? Fix the App is a student that is getting competent at calculating his own stuff, which is really cool. And yeah, back when I was doing the example, Smiley, adding calcium to increase the pH would be good in these cases where the pH is low, creating an abundance of exchangeable hydrogen, which drops all those other values, which, as you saw, they're all comparatively deficient in magnesium. It's also positively charged. Potassium is also positively charged. So the interaction of all these elements together, along with the negatively charged elements, sulfur and phosphorus and the trace minerals, they all work together, creating pH. They drive pH rather. So, and yeah, another good. David King's a fun student. He's been growing cannabis for a long ass time. Has some good, legitimate, real world, in the trenches, been doing it, experience. So that's the cool part about the soil balancing class is you got dudes like David King in there dropping 40 years of like high level Mendocino badassery. So it's really cool to see, that's my favorite part, honestly. Like Sarah and I have figured out some things that other people haven't figured out and that most of the agricultural world isn't doing. And so when we take somebody like David, who's got like tremendous pedigree in growing cannabis, and we make 2 minor tweaks and give him 2 new tools, this entire another like game board unlocks. And that's my favorite stuff, to be completely honest. I love it when you take somebody who's been farming a long time and you teach them how to use biology and you teach them how to be strategic with mineral chemistry, and it completely unlocks other potential, which is otherwise unrealized. And it's my personal assertion that even though we think we're doing a great job, I still believe everything we do is limiting the genetic potential of these plants. And when we correct mineral chemistry, we unlock more genetic potential that we're suppressing with bad soil management practices. When we incorporate biological strategies and soil food web methods, we're incorporating 300 million years of evolution that unlocks more potential that we're suppressing. So even though we're in like, current time, I don't even know how to say it, but like, the cannabis industry is the oldest it's ever been. And I believe we're still across the board significantly hindering peak potential of those plants. And the purpose of our master classes and what we define as the Crescive method is just continuing to unlock that peak potential. And one of the things you'll see is we rarely talk about results because most people just be like, you're lying. But we've been doubling outcomes for, almost a decade now at some of the top farms on the planet. And one of the reasons we don't talk about it is the top farms on the planet don't want to be like, these dudes doubled my yield, but that's what's really happening. So, we're pretty proud of what we're providing, and we're in a new era of our own journey in now equipping you to be as good in these aspects as we are. And that's my sole goal right now. The easiest way to move the market, in my opinion, is with you guys, one-on-one. I've tried to move the businesses. I've tried to move the soil blenders. I've tried to move the influencers. I've tried to move the internet retailers. I'm done trying to move them. I'm now moving you. And so that's why we're doing these master classes, because once you become equipped with knowledge, like no Instagram influencer can like change your mind. It ain't gonna happen. So we're just working one-on-one, and we're creating consultants and advisors and agricultural consultants that are far more qualified than any of the people out there, and that's my current deal. Get off my soapbox, get back to the questions. But yeah, you can definitely apply from another country. We got some people on the other side of the hemisphere down in Australia in the soil balancing class. We got a couple Canadians. I do teach a European class, which is hard because that has to be done at like 9 o'clock Mountain Time. So I just finished one European class where I meet at 12 Mountain Time, and that just ended a couple weeks ago, and I'm about halfway through another European class that meets at 9 a.m. at Mountain Time. But those are one-on-one classes with consultants. So I'm certainly open to do that, but that's a different price, right? So if you want me to meet one-on-one, I'm certainly happy to do it. It was a different price. But I don't personally care where you come from. You can come from Mars for all I care. If we're going to move to Mars, we're going to need to know mineral chemistry to tune that place up. So yeah, you can apply from wherever you want. It's just, will you be awake at the hours that we're holding the classes, which are most likely to be during times when other people can jump in. And what's up, Kay the Guy? Kay the Guy is another YouTube we've done some really cool interviews with. I think one of the coolest videos I've done was the interview with Kay the Guy, because it was real, I don't want to say intimate, that sounds kind of weird, but I gave like a very honest opinion of like this journey, and I tried to provide. So I think it's a cool interview. Check out that on his page. He's broken it up real nice into little bite-sized bits. The next soil chemistry class will be starting November 3rd, and it will run on Thursdays. It will run for 8 sessions, but not 8 sessions in a row. Typically what we do is we go 3 or 4 sessions. We take a week or 2 off. We take a session, take a week off, and we tend to spread it out, because it is a shitload of information to try to dump on you. The first class I did, we did 5 sessions. That was not near enough. The second session, we did 6 sessions. That still wasn't enough. In these last 2 classes, I've done 8 sessions. And then now on top of that, like I said earlier, we meet once a month for all mineral balancing students from any class. So we're really trying to build community. We're really trying to build extremely qualified technicians. Kay the Guy's a soil food web guy. He's got that down. We get him the soil balancing class. It's going to be a good time. And so David King's chiming in with the ridiculous kabillion parts per million. Yeah, you got to be real careful with these green wastes. Bio waste, hospital bio waste. Holy crap! There's all kinds of nasty stuff that goes into green waste, and it's really like playing Russian roulette, like that street game of like, where's the pea? You might get the one with the dead bodies and the batteries and the radioactive waste, and like, for those who've been following along, this receding hairline came from making soil and the obstacles with, compost. In the last 3 years, this motherfucker's jumped back about a half an inch, and it's all soil making related. I promise you that. That shit aged me. It's crazy. So we now make our own compost specifically for soil, because I just can't even deal with it. You're seeing it with, I don't want to get into naming names, but there's recently some more heavy metal issues with a soil manufacturer. You can say whatever you want about where it is. It's in the compost, I promise you. You can load that thing up. There's not enough minerals in that brand's soil to create heavy metal issues. It's in the compost. So in my opinion, compost got to go from that brand. It plunges the pH. It's Russian roulette with heavy metals. Might be profitable for the business, but it's not helpful to the farmers. Mountainscape Solution is asking regarding the adjusting of pH liquid feeds. I see very high and low pH when adding products like silica or small amounts of micronized calcium carbonate. Will these feeds start to alter the pH of soil? So yeah, that totally happens. When we look at a water test for a soil, and then when we look at the soil test and the water test, there's usually similar patterns. So if the water is high in magnesium, it will most often be high in magnesium in the soil, because it sounds kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but there's minerals in the water, and when you water the field, those minerals are deposited. So some of them get taken up in the plants, but some do get deposited. So yes, whatever you put in a liquid solution and add to that soil, it will start to trend over time. So it's my personal belief that before you even start farming, you should do a water test. We see some horrendous water test values that force you into things like reverse osmosis, which is my least favorite, but sometimes it just has to happen. ultimately, if it was our choice, we would choose not to even farm at those farms with some of these really bad waters. To be more direct in the answering of the question, if you're having an undesirable pH, taking water aspects out, so carbonates in the water, bicarbonates in the water, mineral components, sodium, things like that, taking that aspect out, and you're just talking about building fertility in a water solution, if the minerals in that water are balanced, the pH should be in range. So if your pH is too high and you're using silica, then you got too much silica in there. Or calcium carbonate. I probably wouldn't use the carbonates in a liquid feed. I would try to use a different source, maybe gypsum or another form of calcium. Like calcium boron is something we sell through our CGG website. I would prefer that, or even a CalMag. So I would examine what it is you're putting in this feed, and I would examine that feed recipe through a lab to see what mineral composition is in there. And if the pH is extremely low or extremely high, I would assert that it's almost certain that the mineral balance of that feed is also off. So I would look into that. One of the things that we do when we're building fertilizer recipes or nutrient feeds, I like to say, for our farm clients, one thing we'll do is we'll start measuring the pH of the water, and then as we add each ingredient, we'll again measure the pH. And it doesn't circumvent the need for doing a water test, but you can look at that breakdown and get a good indication of what might be too high or too low based on how the pH corrected. So my answer would be always do a test of your water beforehand, and ideally do a water test of the feed itself. If you want to go even a step further and correlate that to mineral balancing and mineral chemistry, then I would send your feed in to be ran with the saturated paste test. People get really hung up on saturated paste test numbers, but they don't even look at what happens to saturated paste when you add a feed to that. And so I would do that too. So yeah. So as far as lab testing, Logan Lab does a decent, for a home gardener, it's fairly acceptable. It tells the higher test is $42, and it gives you calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, iron, nitrate, chloride, bicarbonate, and then 2 water quality parameters, I believe, alkalinity and hardness. I think the major deficiency in the Logan Lab test is it's missing trace minerals. So in our commercial work, in trying to be affordable using the Logan Lab test, we've missed either the lack of a trace mineral in a feed or the toxicity of a trace mineral in a source water that led to problems that took longer than necessary to figure out. So I think if you're the home gardener, the $42 test from Logan is cool. I absolutely adore Logan Labs. I would really like to see them do a more comprehensive water test. Maybe call in and ask them. Typically these businesses make changes when people call in and ask for them to provide a different service. So I would really we send soil samples to Logan all the time, then we send water samples to a lab in LA, and it's sometimes overly complicated. I'm perfectly happy sending them all to one place. So Wallace can do a decent job, or Logan can do a decent job. In our commercial consulting work, we use a lab called Wallace. They're in El Segundo. In my opinion, they have the most comprehensive, most accurate test for nutrient and water testing out there. And it's the most comprehensive for the dollar. It is $95 now, which sounds like a lot. But if you're a commercial cannabis farm and you don't catch that there's heavy metals in your feeds or in your source water and you have crop loss, I mean, it's very easy to be somewhere between $100,000 and $1 million in financial loss due to not identifying that. So to me, that's non-negotiable. And then in the case of smaller farms, even if you're running a 4-light back bedroom, I've not seen a situation where a farmer spent $42 on a water test and did not get that $42 back by dealing with it. So we're always going to advocate that. My first question for Steve would be, what's causing the high pH? And what do we need to do to correct it? So I think this was a question about back about the Malick 3 test. So there's two main tests that we get done at Logan. There's the Malick 3 test, which uses a stronger acid extraction agent to dissolve more nutrients in that soil. I don't really believe it does all mineral nutrients in that soil, but it does a lot of them. And that is meant to define the total nutrient pool. The second test that we often get is called the saturated paste test. They run that test with deionized water or reverse osmosis water, commonly known as. Or I think better than that is you send in your water source to run with the test to look at the saturated paste test. So the saturated paste test is meant to indicate what is currently water soluble and or available to the roots. And that's important. I think a lot of cannabis farmers have gotten overly fascinated with the saturated paste test. And I don't find that focusing on the saturated paste test leads to that good of results. Space Cat knows what's up. So, yeah. So, yeah. And David's been in on this. So there's another thing I guess I didn't mention is some of the members in the soil balancing class have started a study session, and we have a like a Zoom link where you can jump on and ask questions. So what I'm trying to provide is an environment for a place where people can be authentic, where they can be honest, and we can find actual solutions. It's none of this like Instagram flossing, like it's real shit. If your plants are messed up, we're gonna figure it out. So it's pretty cool to see that the people within the class are doing that. They're building community, they're helping each other out, and people are having some pretty remarkable results. So I'm pretty proud of that. So I'll give it another couple minutes real quick if anybody got any last questions. If you've hung on this long, you've probably already heard me a couple times, but I'll do it one more time while we are waiting for any last straggler questions. But soil balancing class, again, fires up November 3rd. It'll be held on Thursdays at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Go to our website. You click on this little button and you apply to the class, fill out a little questionnaire, let us know some information about yourself and whatnot, and then we will fill the class up. When the class is full, we'll close it off because we want to help a lot of people, but I also want to a certain degree, limit class size so it's manageable for me as an educator. Like I'm not a professional teacher. I'm learning along the way as well. So, I don't, if there's a certain number of students in there, I can manage that. And I want to make sure that everybody gets the experience that they're after, and then people get one-on-one time that they need. Also, I guess something I didn't mention is that each class session has a recording that goes with it that's available on our website, and you can review that as many times as you need. And then everybody in the class gets access to the soil calculator tool and the forum, like I said. So, yeah, man, you're going to have to jump on, hit the rewind button, start it all over. So I guess with that, I thank you for your time. And if you've stuck around this long, I appreciate it. Check out the website. If you got any questions, drop them in the comments. And for those of you that are going to join, we'll see you in the soil balancing class starting Thursday. And we'll see you next Wednesday for Science Bro talking about the next topic. Thanks for tuning in.